Good morning, Dicken.
Hi, Maria.
First of all, thank you so much for doing this interview with me. I'm really excited to do it because I've known you as my mentor and my teacher about the principles for so many years, but I've never really known you from a writing perspective. So I think most people who will be watching this recording will know who you are, but for those people who don't, Dicken is a leader in the field of the three principles. One of the, I call him the elder statesman in the field of the principles, and was a psychologist many years, trained psychologist, and then kind of changed his work over to the three principles after meeting Sid Banks. I'm always jealous of people who have met Sid Banks in person, but and you're also the author, along with Natasha Swerdloff, of Coming Home, which is one of my favourite Three Principles books. I've read it on a number of times now, and I love to pick it up and just open it up on a page and read it. I think it's so beautifully written. So I'm delighted to be able to have this conversation with you, a different conversation for us about your writing career. I don't know if it's a career or what, but so if we could start, it would be really lovely if you could start with just telling me how you got started writing. Was it a new phenomenon when you started writing the book, or is it something that started before that?
Early in college, I got interested in creativity, and I read lots of books on creativity. So I started getting this notion that we all have the capacity to get new thinking. And then I took a poetry writing course in college. I was an English major. And I started reading and studying not only poetry, but also the poets themselves and what they said about writing poetry. And for the course, I had to write papers, and I started making the connection between creativity and writing. Then in the very deep quiet of our minds, new and fresh images and ideas can emerge. And I was so taken by that, Maria, it started to define my life very early on. And so I began to see the connection between relaxation and inner quiet and creativity. So I studied relaxation techniques. I learned and taught self-hypnosis as a way of deep relaxation, because in hypnosis, you relax very deeply, and then suggestions can be made that are helpful to you. But I was more intrigued by in deep, relaxed states that our own new and fresh thinking can come. And then at one point I read, I think it was Ben Franklin, I could be wrong, but it was someone who valued creativity in writing, and he would lie on his back with his elbow on the ground, but his hand up in the air, holding a ball. And then he'd go to sleep, and as soon as he'd fall asleep, the ball would drop, and he'd wake up and see what new thought was the first thought present. And he'd use that as a basis for writing. So I did that for writing poetry. And then after I graduated from college, I started teaching high school English. And I had a lot of kids who did not like school, did not like writing, did not like English, and wouldn't even consider reading a poem. So I'm going, how am I going to help them develop a passion for writing poetry? And so in a quiet moment, I had this idea on how to do it. So I came into the class and I had everybody have a blank piece of paper and a pen on their desk. And I turned out the lights in the classroom, which never happens. I said, put your heads down. We're just going to relax today. And of course, they were thrilled. And I took them through a relaxation exercise. They got very, very relaxed. And everybody was really, really relaxed. And I said, in a minute, as you're resting there in the darkness of your mind, a word will emerge. Just open your eyes enough to write down that word and then close your eyes again, go right back to that same place and wait until you get another word. And keep doing this until you have 10 words. And when they finished, I took them through an exercise to gradually bring them back into the room and then eventually turn the lights back on. And I said, now, these are your words, no one else's. And your combination of words are unique to the world. No one else has these words these 10 words. Rearrange these words in any order without adding any other words in a way that makes sense to you or that sounds right to you or that is interesting to you. And they did. And then I said, would anyone like to read your words? Now, these are kids that would usually not speak up in class, but they were excited about what they had just created. A lot of them were really excited. And they started raising their hands and standing up and reading their poem, and everybody's going, oh, wow, that's so cool. And I talk about the images in their poem, and pretty soon they're getting excited about the creative process of writing. And then I could take lyrics from songs that they liked and print them out and give it to them and have them read them. And they go, oh, we don't like, and all of a sudden they go, hey, wait a minute, this is this song. And I'm going, yeah, songs are poetry. And I tell you, these kids became passionate about writing in the same way that I did. Mm. And later on, I met Sydney Banks, and he's talking about the very nature of the universe is that, and the great mystery of life is that out of nothing comes everything. Mm. And I started saying, we are living in a creative-based world. So anybody who says they're not creative have no idea what their true nature is. And then I started applying that to the work that I do as a psychologist and helping people access their original, authentic voice, if you will. And it just was seamless. It's all been part of one, and it encouraged me to study quantum physics, where they talk about out of nothing, everything comes out of the quantum field. Matter is a temporary arising of life energy, temporary condensation that dances around and then goes back in. And I said, well, that's writing. That's what writing is. The arising of new and fresh energy taking form as images and words. And then we get to share those with other people. That's my,
Wow.
that's my, how I got into writing was through creativity.
I love how you describe that, because I see through my own writing, I see how I sit there with absolutely nothing on my mind and just wait for something.
Yeah.
And even just this last week in the writing that I've been doing on a daily basis, it's like everything has slowed right down. I have to wait such a long time sometimes for the words to come through. This is just happening to me this week. It hasn't always happened this way, but in this really, really slow way, just waiting for words to come up.
Yeah.
It's just been amazing. So as you were talking about that, and like that out of nothing, okay, now, because I notice when my head starts to get in the way, but I ignore that and still wait for this to come. It's just so cool to have it described in the way that you've just described it, and being able to relate it to my experience. So you've pretty much always written then, like.
I've always loved getting really quiet and seeing what new and fresh words arise. And I do it daily. I have for years and years and years, many times often during the day. I do that. And now in my work, it helps me find new and fresh ways to talk about what I'm sharing with people about how life works.
So how did the book come into form then?
As soon as I learned the principles, I started thinking it would be great to write something about it. But on some level too, I knew that I didn't want to write until I felt like I wasn't writing it from the intellect, but from my deep knowing.
Mm-hmm.
So I waited 20 years.
And so you waited quite a while for that then.
I waited 20 years, and I knew, and people kept asking me, when are you going to write a book about this? And it was one of those things, Maria, is I started getting this sense that I wanted to, was getting stronger and stronger. And I was feeling more and more grounded in my own being, so that I wanted to write a book. This was clear to me. I didn't want it to be about me.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted it to be a book that was about what I was seeing as being true, independent of whether people believe it or not.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to point toward the connection between this formless creative energy and our psychological experience of life. So I was sharing a lot of my ideas. Natasha Swerdloff, I began to do mentoring sessions with her and sharing my passion for this creative process and how it's echoed in our own psychological lives. And she was very excited about this and very excited about what she was learning. And so she would write down a lot of what we talked about and send it back to me. And I said, oh my gosh, this is sounding like what I wanted to say at some point. And Natasha asked me if I wanted to write with her. And so I didn't even have to think about it. It just at that moment, I knew this was the time. I knew that she could take my wildly creative nature and put it into a readable form. And she was brilliant at that. And we loved bouncing ideas off each other. And most often, we would meet on a regular basis, both in person and over the internet. And very often we wouldn't even write, we would just share what we were seeing or realizing about some aspect of what we wanted to write about. And then we each went off and wrote, because I couldn't write with her, I could rewrite with her.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would go off and get quiet, and like going to an island in Maine for 2 weeks and spending time every day just getting really quiet, and then just writing from inspiration and not even worrying about it. Was later I cut and paste. Mm-hmm. But it was just to tap into that creative flow. And that's how most of my writing, that's how all of my writing was done, using that creative process. I did not want to write it unless it came out of that space.
Yeah.
Unless it was inspired. I did not want to write from what I knew in my intellect and memory about the principles. So, and I was a real stickler on that. You know, at one point, Natasha said in our first conversation, she goes, okay, I was thinking about this for our schedule and this, and I said, Natasha, I'm not going to do it that way. If it takes a month to write this book, great. If it takes years to write this book, I don't care. It's got to be inspired and not be writing under the pressure of a deadline. Now, that was just me and my temperament, how I work best. And that's, Natasha saw the logic of that and saw how important that was to me. So that's, we wrote without the pressure of any schedule. We wrote because of the love of writing about this and refining our message so that it would have more impact with people.
There's so many things in there I could pick up on.
I know.
One,
Same here.
One was to do with the fact that you knew you were going to write a book. For 20 years, you knew that you were going to.
I did.
And it was, but you kind of, it sounds like you really trusted that when the time was right for it, it would happen.
Yeah.
And then the other
thing. Well, that's another thing that I was learning is that this deeper intelligence, when we get our personal thinking out of the way, this deeper intelligence guides us perfectly. Mm. And I had really learned to trust that, both through trusting the creative process and then from what I learned from Sydney Banks, 23 years of being with him, and then there's been another 10 years of studying his work after that. So 33 years of hearing about this, our connection to a deeper intelligence and the importance and value of trusting that, listening for that, allowing it to move us. So I didn't struggle over that, Maria. I just knew when it was time, I'd know. Mm. And I am so glad that I trusted that and waited. It didn't feel like I was waiting. It was just, when it's right, I'll know, and then it'll be perfect. And And no question, it wouldn't have been the book that I wrote if I'd done it 20 years earlier. It would have been so influenced by ideas and beliefs that I was holding on to, and it wouldn't have been as universal. It would have been much more personal, which would have, I mean, there's nothing wrong with a book that's personal, but that's not what I wanted to write. I wanted one that people could pick up in 10 years and it wouldn't be dated. I didn't want it to be dated for this book.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought it was pretty audacious even to think that I could write about the very nature of life, very nature of human beings. And so I wanted to make sure it came out of realization rather than excitement over ideas. And I could tell the difference in our writing. Natasha and I could too. We would know, you know, in terms of how we work together, we never had a disagreement or argument in 2 years of working closely together, because we both were committed to a notion if something we wrote didn't feel really good to both of us, went, oh, that's it, that's perfect, that's it, beautiful. If it didn't have that feeling, rather than trying to just edit it, sort of keep rewriting that, this was sort of shocking to Natasha, was I'd say, throw it away. We're throw that chapter away that we've spent the last 2 months on. We'll start over. It'll be much better. She go, well, I'll save it. I'll save it here. I'll just save this. And she had files and files of things she saved, and then we would get quiet, and something would occur. The one or the other of us, they would go, that's it. So we didn't have to argue. We didn't have to disagree. We both could recognize when it wasn't inspired in a way that made sense to both of us. That was our criteria. So I learned more about true collaboration. And it's the reason we were able to write with one voice rather than two different writers writing from two different voices.
Yeah.
This is really, it was really unusual, is because we got so deeply aligned around what felt right and made sense, we could write together in a way that we weren't conflicting voices ever. And I love that. I absolutely love that. You know how sometimes writers say, I can't take any credit for this. I was just the scribe, the muse wrote this and I just transcribed it, you know. That's how we felt, was we wanted wisdom to be the author of this book, not Dicken or Natasha. We got out of the way. And Natasha will tell you, there was times when we're sitting side by side and we're going over something and it just wasn't feeling good. And right then and there, I just stop. I did this any number of times. Lean back, close my eyes, and it was like I was taking a nap. And 20 minutes later, out of that deep quiet, I just start talking, and she'd write down as fast as she could what I was saying, because it was so deeply fresh and inspired. We go, that's it. That's what we need to say about this. And it would blow both of us away. It was, I have a friend who's a professional drummer, and he would say, sometimes when I'm playing, I'm just not there anymore, and the other guy shows up and plays. So I used to joke with Natasha all the time about, we still use that joke, because isn't it great when the other guy shows up, when the other woman shows up and sort of takes over, you know, that authentic creative impulse that's not even personal. So That's how we saw the writing process. If we could get our egos out of the way, temporarily set aside our intellect, and see what would come that was really inspired, new, and fresh. So I love the creative process because it feels good to relax. It feels good to rest in not knowing. And it feels good to have new and fresh come that's uplifting. So if writing doesn't feel good, I think there's something wrong with it. I'm not a struggling artist. I'm not a suffering artist. Someone who has fallen in love with the creative process and embraced that as not only a way to write, but a way to live. Mm. So all during the day, I go to the creative place and get renewed in spirit, get refreshed. And if something in life doesn't feel right, or something in my relationships doesn't feel right, I no longer try to solve it with my intellect. I go to the creative place and get new and fresh feelings that reconnect me to life or to that person, and then new and fresh inspiration for how to respond to them in a more loving, kind-hearted way. So it's become a lifestyle rather than something I do in order to accomplish a certain goal. And then writing is just part of that.
I love that you just said that. Because that's one of the things that I say to the people that I've been working with. It's like whatever shows up in life shows up in writing your book. And what I really loved about what you said was it isn't that you, like everything that you wrote just came first time. I love how you described that about what words did you use? Something about it's creativity is it's coming out of the flow. So what I would call a first draft is coming from that place. But you also were saying that there was elements that were written that weren't right. Now a lot of people would have a lot of thinking about that, and they would, starting to think that it's not worth writing the book because it's not coming out right and all this kind of thing. And your trust of the whole creative process and like includes stuff coming out and onto the page that isn't going to end up in the book.
Yeah, it usually got muddled up with ideas I was attached to. Mm. And so it got muddled. So it didn't have the same feeling. It didn't have that authentic feel. And we could tell, just like when you're talking with someone and having a conversation, you can tell when there's a feeling of connection and aliveness, and you can tell when suddenly it starts getting awkward. Mm. So it's the same thing as when my writing got awkward. Both Natasha and I could tell. Mm-hmm. And I didn't care that we threw away stuff because I love the creative process, right? So like it's worthwhile, even if for some reason the book never came out, it would have been fun living creatively like that during that time I was writing the book.
Yes.
You see what I mean? It's not like, oh my God, we're wasting time. It's like, well, if I died today, I sure have fun writing this. It sure has been fun. I mean, creativity for me is never a struggle. I relax deeply, which feels good. And then I see what comes, which feels good, right? So if it's not feeling good, I'm working too hard, or I'm trying to have something work, or I'm overriding my wisdom and with my intellect in a way that's not helpful, and the intellect and wisdom are no longer working in harmony. So awkwardness is just letting me know intellect and wisdom are not in harmony right now. Because the intellect is very important in writing and helpful, and things that I've learned and have stored in memory, and all of that is helpful if it's shaped by wisdom.
Mm.
On its own, it has no impact with readers. Just like in my work as a helping people as a mentor, is my words only have impact if they point people toward the place where they get new and fresh. But if my words come from my intellect, they don't serve that purpose.
Mm.
And people don't get quieter and more trusting of their wisdom.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I love what you said about the intellect does start to have a role. It does have a role in writing the book.
Yeah.
Could you say more about that?
Well, first of all, wisdom draws on things in your intellect. Like if you can't remember somebody's name and you try to remember it and go through the alphabet and you still can't remember it, and then you get quiet, and then wisdom brings that name to you from your intellect.
Mm.
So it has that role. Our life experiences, what we have realized experientially, and ways in which some of that is in memory, is valuable when it's new and fresh, when wisdom reforms it.
Mm-hmm.
Or I like to think wisdom informs the intellect. It brings into form what's of value in the intellect, as well as completely original, new and fresh. But then at some point, I had to put on my English teacher hat, and so did Natasha, and we had to go through it for readability, go through it for grammatical sense, and we would do that together. Mm-hmm. Because we both had a real good eye for that, if you will. I didn't want to be thinking about any of that while I was writing.
No.
And then, so if we did something by the internet, we'd screen share the text and go through it, and then we could do our preliminary edit. You know, it's very interesting because when you write from wisdom, there's a deeper logic to it. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And then when you fine tune with the intellect through that kind of critical eye editing, when we took it to the editor, he was blown away. He says, I rarely get a manuscript that's already in such good shape. He said, usually I do 3 complete stages of editing. I can tell already with yours, I'm only going to need to do 2.
Wow.
He says, I rarely get something that's this clean, this organized. I don't even have recommendations for reorganizing things in your book, which I always do. All right. So that felt good. That was another indication. This is where I see the intellect and wisdom, when they work in harmony, it's all part of a lovely creative process. So that even the editing was fun. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a struggle because, you know, we'd still get quiet and then see what made most sense grammatically. You know, so. And then Natasha was way better than I of saying things like, we talk about this here, but we haven't even introduced people to that idea. So we have to introduce them to that idea. So we would do our own reordering so that the flow and logic of the book worked well. And Natasha was so good at that. Oh, so good at that. That it made it the book that it is. It wouldn't be the book that it is if I hadn't done that. So it was another reason why I was just glad I collaborated with someone that was so easy to collaborate with, who valued the creative process, who understood going back to the drawing board. And that's not as a backward step, but a proactive step. And then loved refining it so that it was in service. Both of us were committed. This book has to be of service to our readers. It's not a showcase for who we are. It's we're doing the best we can to point people toward this creative nature of life that we've fallen in love with, and we know when people experience it, they'll fall in love with it too.
I love that you were so clear about what you wanted the book to be.
Yeah,
that's really clear. I remember when I first published my book, I knew I wanted to write a book for years, but I had no clue what I wanted. This was my first book. No clue what I wanted it to be about. But I did know that I didn't want it to be something that was already out there.
yeah.
I knew I wanted it to be.
See, that's a lot right there.
I had no clue what it was going to be, and then till one day, just this idea popped into my head, and then that started the basis of it. So,
don't you love that?
Yeah.
Wow. It popped into my head. You know, in creativity, they always say it came in out of the blue, right? So I love that process. And then when I met Sid Banks, I got interested in, well, what is the blue?
Yes, yes.
Not intellectually, but experientially.
Yeah.
What more can I see about that?
What I love about this conversation is that the experience that you had of writing the book, like 2 years, the collaboration, the coming from this deeper place, the editing process, the stuff being written and it not being right, and then other stuff, and then moving things around and involving an editor. It's exactly the same process that everybody else who writes a book goes through. But the journey itself for you sounds a lot easier than most people experience.
Because I've learned, and primarily from the teachings of Sydney Banks, that any time I experience tension or stress or confusion or uncertainty, that's an indication that I'm starting to misuse my intellect, and it's an invitation to immediately step back from my intellect into the unknown. And if I only relied on the intellect, that would be death. Mm-hmm. But with an understanding of wisdom, it's basically saying when I feel tension, stress, or upset, it's an invitation to let wisdom weigh in so there's a balance. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't suffer through the writing process. And that tension and stress or confusion and uncertainty or doubt became a good thing. Mm-hmm. It was reminding me that I'm connected to a deeper intelligence, and it was an invitation to throw myself wide open to the stars again, literally. Mm-hmm. And so it was, it's what makes my life easier psychologically, and it made my life easier in writing because it was the same understanding was helpful. Yeah.
So just the last piece in the journey is the publishing bit. So you've written it all, you've got to a point where you're happy with it, the editors looked at it. How did you get it published?
Well, we talked to a number of people that had had books published by publishers, and we talked to them about the process and what they saw the benefits, what they thought the downsides were. We researched it. we really looked into it, and we then also looked into self-publishing and researched that and talked to people. And we love the ease and availability if you self-publish through Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
And not having to use a middle person. Now our book has been published in like 6 different languages. We got 2 or 3 more in the works. And we can do all of that through the same self-publishing house, and make it much easier for accessibility.
Yeah.
And I like how they do it. They don't print the books until there's the demand, and then they do another printing. And so it's ecologically, it's more sound in that way. And you don't have thousands of books sitting around, you know, in warehouses or in bookstores, and so we decided to do that, and we hired. It was sort of an interesting journey. We hired one editor who it was more about them than about being of service. And pretty soon I got so uncomfortable. I said, Natasha, I can't work with this person. They have good credentials, but it's just not going to work out. So we let that person go, and we found another editor who was more familiar with the material. He had edited other Sid Banks books and was a professional editor. And oh my God, what a difference.
Yeah, I bet.
Totally in service to creating the best book for readers. And so easy to work with, no ego involved. So that was thrilling. And then we wanted a graphic designer, and we found someone, and it worked well for a while, but then again, it wasn't sort of in service of our vision, so we found another graphic designer. And to be able to produce and create exactly what we wanted to in the way we wanted to. And that was another thing about not having a publishing house, which then can influence what you write and tell you how the title they want for the book, and often suggest things that you're not keen on doing, but they say we insist on it because of our readers. And we didn't. We certainly did not with this book, which is also it would take the perfect publisher to really have a deep understanding of what we were trying to say,
Yeah.
so that they wouldn't turn it into, like you said, something that's already in the world that maybe would sell more copies.
Yeah.
And that was not our criteria.
I'm really delighted that you didn't have a really straightforward experience. Like it didn't all just go swimming.
No, it didn't. No.
Well,
When it came to working with other people, we wanted people that could collaborate with us the way we were collaborating, and that also had little ego and were totally in service to the project, and so that it could have impact for people. So I had extremely, we both did high standards for who we wanted to help us do editing and graphic designing. And I'm so glad we trusted our instincts.
Yeah.
It really made, with our decisions on that were also made the same way. In a quiet moment, we just knew. In the same way you can know when something is right, you can know when something's not right.
Yeah.
And learning to trust that instead of overriding it.
Well, in my humble opinion, it certainly had the desired effect, because I think it's such a beautiful, beautiful book. And I'd already thought that. You said it earlier about I can't tell reading it, and I know you pretty well. I couldn't tell what was yours and what was Natasha's.
Yeah, no.
Absolutely couldn't.
We both were thrilled that that was true.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that was unusual for a writing collaboration of a book like this, to have a single voice. But the single voice was what occurred from a deeper place than either of us personally. And that's the only reason we could do that.
Yeah.
We were committed to that. That was exciting. We both love that aspect of this writing project.
Lovely. So I just want to ask you one more question. We've talked a bit longer than I said, but I just couldn't keep this short. So there is a lot of people now who have come across the principles and have some understanding of the principles and also want to write a book. What kind of guidance, advice, tips would you give to people who want to do that?
When I first learned the principles, I was so excited about what I could remember.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I was trained academically. I had so many years of schooling where I got rewarded for what I could remember. So I was very good at like hearing George Bransky talk in the early days, or Sid talk, and remembering their stories, and then I'd tell them as my stories. In other words, I'm just passing on from my intellect to other people.
Yeah.
And I've done writing like that. And people can say all the right things, but it's not what they've experientially realized, so that it's now coming from that place within themselves. So I would encourage people that write to have an understanding of the difference between, it's just like with new teachers often teach from their intellect, and you can tell, and it doesn't have an impact of somebody who barely says as much, but it comes from that feeling,
Mm-hmm.
that knowing, that deeper knowing, feeling place. And so when writing comes from there, it's going to be helpful and have an impact. So that's sort of my criteria for new writers, is the one I used on myself. I'm not saying people would have to wait 20 years to write an inspired book about the principles.
No.
Totally not true. That was just me, because I wasn't writing about an application of the principles. I was trying to write about the principles themselves.
Yeah.
No one else had really done that but Sid. And it was like, who do I think I am? Oh my God. Well, I've got to really be a creative channel for this book, or I have no business writing it.
Mm-hmm.
Application books are different. People are telling their own story, in a sense, their own examples, their own metaphors. A lot of people have written beautiful books about the principles, because it's, as Sid would say, keep it simple. Only talk about what you know. If you don't know about the principle of mind, don't talk about it. For years when I taught, I only taught the principle of thought, because I had no clue about how to talk about consciousness or mind other than from my intellect.
Yeah.
Until I saw it deeper, until I started connecting the dots and seeing the creative nature of life. And connecting that to my love of creativity. And then it was like, whoa, I got a lot to say here. If I can help disaffected teenagers who hate English and hate poetry, if I can help them learn how to love writing poetry, then there's something in that if what we say is pointing people toward that in themselves. See, that was Sid's criteria. Is this book a reflection of you, or is it pointing people toward the wisdom within themselves? At one point I talked with Sid, and he said there were a couple hundred people a day getting off the ferry on this little island looking for him, coming from all over the world. Can you imagine? I said, my God, Sid, what did you do? And he said, I told him to go home. He said, the wisdom you seek, you can't get from another person. You can only find it in the deep quiet of your own being, your own consciousness, your own mind. Right? That's your teacher. So when that becomes a person's teacher and they let that teacher guide their writing, it'll have an impact. It'll be helpful to the world. Mm-hmm. If it's just sharing things you've heard other people say or trying to say it the way they say it, the strange thing is they'll sound great, but it won't have any impact. Mm-hmm. It doesn't resonate beyond the intellect. It will be one intellect talking to another intellect. So that's it. It's a much better way to write, though. It's more enjoyable. It's a deeply fulfilling creative process. You know, I encourage everybody to write that way, no matter what they're writing.
Yes. Oh, wow. Well, Dicken, that's been really beautiful. I love this conversation with you. Really, really lovely. Thank you.
It was fun. I did the same thing yesterday as I got quiet, and all this stuff about my early creativity came to mind. I hadn't thought about that. I was just going to talk to you about writing my book. And all of a sudden, the whole thing of the look on the kids' faces reading their poetry came to mind. It was like, oh my God. This started, my interest in writing started long before even I started writing. or knowing that I was a writer.
Yeah. It's interesting because like I look at where I am now in terms of writing, and you know, I had thoughts about the book that was published in mine was published in 2014, even just literally written just before I met you.
Wow.
But like I'm seeing now how my writing career began a lot earlier than I thought it had. Like you can see, looking back, I can see the breadcrumbs. You know, the trail that kind of system has been, you know, kind of moving and shaking, I was going to say. Oh. Well, thank you so much, Dicken. So your book is coming home with Natasha Swerdloff, and it's in so many languages, isn't it? But people could just find it on Amazon, can't they?
Yeah, they can. Yeah.
That's just really lovely. So thank you so much, Dicken. I really.
You're welcome. I've loved doing this with you, Marie.
Thank you.
I'm a big fan of your writing, so because I know where it comes from.
I do my best.
I'm onto you, Marie.
Lovely.